In the world of royal security, there exists an unwritten rule that has governed the British Royal Protection Unit for decades. Never break protocol, no matter what. Personal feelings, instincts, and even family bonds must always take a back seat to established procedures. But what happens when a seasoned royal guard, trained to follow orders without question, suddenly finds herself facing a moment where protocol could mean the difference between life and death for someone she's sworn to protect? On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday evening at Kensington Palace, during what should have been a routine family gathering, Detective Sergeant Sarah Mitchell would discover that some rules are meant to be broken. Her decision to trust her instincts over her training would not only save a young princess, but also forever change how the Royal Protection Unit approaches their most sacred duty. This is the true story of how one woman's courage to act against everything she was taught became the catalyst for a complete overhaul of royal security protocols, and how a 7-year-old princess's quick thinking under pressure revealed gaps in a system that had been considered foolproof for generations. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Detective Sergeant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her earpiece for the third time that evening. 22 years of service in the Metropolitan Police, with the last 8 dedicated to the Royal Protection Unit, had taught her to trust her instincts. Tonight, however, those same instincts were telling her something was wrong, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what the occasion was. Princess Charlotte's 7th birthday celebration, a private family affair that had been planned for weeks. Unlike the grand public celebrations that marked significant royal milestones, this gathering was meant to be intimate and relaxed. The guest list was small, consisting only of immediate family members, a few close family friends, and the minimal security detail required for such events. Sarah had been assigned to the internal security rotation, which meant her primary responsibility was monitoring the movements within the palace itself rather than perimeter security. It was considered a relatively easy assignment, the kind typically given to senior officers as a way of acknowledging their experience while allowing newer team members to handle the more demanding external security roles. The palace staff had transformed the blue drawing room into a children's wonderland, complete with balloon arrangements, a custom-made birthday cake shaped like a unicorn, and carefully selected entertainment that would appeal to both the birthday girl and her younger brother, Prince Louis. The room buzzed with the controlled chaos that only a children's party could create, even one held within the walls of a royal residence. Princess Charlotte, dressed in a flowing blue dress that matched her eyes, moved through the room with the confidence of someone born into royalty, yet still possessed the genuine excitement of a 7-year-old celebrating her special day. Sarah watched from her designated position near the main entrance, noting how the young princess interacted with each guest, displaying the poise and grace that had been carefully cultivated through years of royal training. Prince William and Catherine, the Prince and Princess of Wales, mingled among the guests with the practiced ease of experienced royals. They managed to be both attentive parents and gracious hosts, ensuring that their daughter's celebration proceeded smoothly while maintaining the dignity expected of their positions. Sarah had worked security for the family numerous times over the past few years and had always been impressed by their ability to balance their public roles with their desire to give their children as normal a childhood as possible. The guest list included several members of the extended royal family, including Princess Anne and her husband, Sir Timothy Lawrence, along with a handful of carefully vetted family friends whose children had formed friendships with the young royals. The Middleton family, Catherine's parents and siblings, were also in attendance, bringing with them the warmth and relatability that had made them beloved figures in royal circles. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself paying particular attention to the interactions between the adults and children. Her training had taught her to observe not just obvious security threats, but also the subtle dynamics that could indicate when something was amiss. She noticed how Charlotte seemed to gravitate towards certain adults while maintaining a polite but noticeable distance from others. The entertainment for the evening included a professional magician who had been thoroughly vetted by the security team weeks in advance. Marcus Pemberton had performed for several high-profile families over the years and came with impeccable references. His background check had revealed nothing more interesting than a parking ticket from 2019 and a completely clean criminal record. He had arrived at the palace 3 hours early to allow security to inspect his equipment and props thoroughly. Pemberton's performance was scheduled to be the highlight of the evening, taking place in the palace's music room, which had been specially prepared for the occasion. The room's acoustics and intimate setting would allow all the guests to enjoy the show while maintaining the security protocols that governed all royal events. Sarah had personally overseen the security sweep of the room earlier that afternoon, ensuring that every possible hiding spot had been checked, and that all potential security vulnerabilities had been addressed. As the time for the magic show approached, Sarah noticed a subtle change in Charlotte's demeanor. The young princess, who had been animated and cheerful throughout the early part of the evening, seemed to become more reserved as the guests began moving toward the music room. At first, Sarah attributed this to nothing more than the natural excitement, and perhaps slight nervousness, that any child might feel when about to be the center of attention during a special performance. The music room filled quickly as guests took their seats on the arranged chairs and small couches that had been positioned to provide optimal viewing of the performance area. Charlotte was given a special throne-like chair at the front, decorated with ribbons and flowers to mark her status as the guest of honor. Prince George sat to her right, while Prince Louis, despite being only 4 years old, managed to sit still in his designated spot to her left. Sarah positioned herself at the back of the room, where she could observe both the performance and the guests without being intrusive. From her vantage point, she had clear sightlines to all entrances and exits, and could easily communicate with the other security personnel stationed throughout the palace. The atmosphere was festive and warm, exactly what one would expect at a child's birthday celebration. Pemberton began his performance with a series of simple card tricks and coin manipulations that delighted the younger guests while demonstrating his skill to the adults. His patter was age-appropriate and engaging, and he showed a natural ability to work with children that explained his reputation as a family entertainer. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly as the performance proceeded without incident, the earlier feeling of unease beginning to fade as she watched the genuine joy on Charlotte's face. However, as Pemberton moved into more elaborate illusions involving props and audience participation, Sarah noticed that Charlotte's enthusiasm seemed forced. The young princess was smiling and clapping at the appropriate moments, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was not as comfortable as she appeared to be. Sarah had spent enough time around the royal children to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when one of them was putting on a brave face despite feeling uncomfortable. The turning point came when Pemberton announced that he would need a volunteer from the audience for his next trick. Without hesitation, he gestured toward Charlotte, inviting the birthday girl to join him in front of the audience. The request was perfectly reasonable and had been discussed and approved during the security briefing earlier in the day. Charlotte was expected to participate in certain aspects of the performance. As part of the celebration, Charlotte rose from her chair with a smile that Sarah now recognized as being more dutiful than genuine. As she walked toward Pemberton, Sarah noticed that the young princess's hands were clasped tightly together, a subtle sign of nervousness that might be missed by casual observers, but was clearly visible to someone trained to read body language and behavioral cues. The trick Pemberton had chosen was a classic disappearing act, involving a large, ornate box that he had wheeled into the center of the performance area. The box was elaborately decorated with mystical symbols and appeared to be an antique piece, though Sarah knew from the earlier security inspection that it was actually a modern construction designed specifically for this type of illusion. Pemberton explained to Charlotte and the audience that she would step into the box, and when he opened it moments later, she would have vanished completely, only to reappear in an unexpected location elsewhere in the room. The trick required Charlotte to remain calm and follow specific instructions once inside the box, and Pemberton spent several minutes explaining exactly what she needed to do. Sarah watched as Charlotte nodded attentively to Pemberton's instructions, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about the interaction was off. The young princess seemed to be asking more questions than necessary, and there was a tension in her posture that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with what was being asked of her. When Charlotte finally stepped into the box, Sarah noted that she paused just before disappearing from view, turning back to look at her parents, with an expression that seemed to convey more than just excitement about participating in a magic trick. Prince William gave her an encouraging nod and smile, clearly unaware of any cause for concern, but Sarah found herself leaning forward slightly, every instinct telling her to pay closer attention to what was happening. Pemberton closed the box with a flourish, engaging the audience with dramatic gestures and mystical incantations designed to build suspense before the big reveal. The performance was proceeding exactly as planned, following the script that had been reviewed and approved by the security team. There was no apparent reason for concern, yet Sarah felt her heart rate increasing as she watched the magician work. As the moments passed, Sarah became increasingly aware that something was wrong, though she couldn't identify exactly what was triggering her alarm. Pemberton's performance was flawless, the audience was engaged and enjoying themselves, and everything was proceeding according to schedule. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important, something that could prove to be significant. It was then that she heard it, a faint sound coming from the direction of the box, barely audible above Pemberton's theatrical presentation. At first, she thought it might be part of the act, perhaps a sound effect designed to enhance the illusion. But as she strained to listen more carefully, she realized that what she was hearing was not part of any planned performance. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate. 3 short taps followed by a brief pause, then repeated. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the pattern. It was Morse code, specifically the International Distress Signal SOS. Someone inside the box was tapping out a call for help. Sarah's mind raced as she processed what she was hearing. Charlotte had been learning about communication codes as part of her education, including basic Morse code, a fact that Sarah knew from previous security briefings about the children's activities and interests. The young princess was using her knowledge to send a distress signal, which could only mean that something had gone seriously wrong with what should have been a simple magic trick. Every fiber of Sarah's training told her to follow protocol, to observe and assess before taking action, to coordinate with other security personnel before making any moves that could disrupt an ongoing event. But her instincts as both a police officer and a human being were screaming at her that a child was in danger and needed immediate help. The tapping continued, becoming slightly more urgent, though still quiet enough that only someone specifically listening for it would notice. Pemberton showed no signs of hearing the distress signal, continuing with his performance as if nothing unusual was happening. The audience remained engaged and unaware, waiting expectantly for the magical reveal that would bring Charlotte back into view. Sarah faced a decision that would define not only the rest of her career but potentially the life of the young princess she was sworn to protect. She could follow protocol, wait for the performance to conclude naturally, and hope that her concerns were unfounded. Or she could trust her instincts, break established security procedures, and potentially save a child's life while risking her own professional future. As the SOS signal continued to tap out from inside the box, Sarah made her choice. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through Pemberton's theatrical presentation with the authority of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions. "Stop the performance immediately," she commanded, her hand moving instinctively toward her radio to alert the other security personnel. "We have a situation." The room fell silent, the festive atmosphere evaporating in an instant as everyone turned to look at the security officer who had just disrupted a child's birthday celebration. Pemberton stopped mid-gesture, confusion and annoyance crossing his face as he processed the unexpected interruption. Prince William and Catherine rose from their seats, their parental instincts immediately alert to the possibility that something was wrong with their daughter. The other guests looked around uncertainly, trying to understand what had just happened and whether they should be concerned for their own safety. Sarah ignored the stares and questioning looks, focusing entirely on the ornate box that had become the center of her attention. The tapping had stopped, but she could hear other sounds now, muffled movement, and what might have been a struggle taking place within the confines of the box. "Princess Charlotte, if you can hear me, tap twice," Sarah called out, her voice clear and authoritative despite the unusual nature of the situation. 2 distinct taps came from inside the box, confirming Sarah's worst fears. The young princess was conscious and able to respond, but something was preventing her from emerging from the box as the trick was supposed to work. Pemberton stepped forward, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern as he realized that something had indeed gone wrong with his carefully planned illusion. "There must be some mechanical malfunction," he said, moving toward the box. "Let me just—" "Stay back," Sarah ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "Do not touch anything until we understand exactly what's happening here." Sarah approached the box carefully, her training taking over as she assessed the situation. The mechanism that was supposed to allow Charlotte to exit the box appeared to have malfunctioned, trapping the young princess inside. What should have been a moment of magical wonder had become a potentially life-threatening emergency. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she examined the ornate box, her years of training kicking in despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. The elaborate exterior, which had seemed so magical moments before, now appeared ominous and threatening. She could hear Charlotte moving inside, but the sounds were becoming weaker, suggesting that the air supply within the confined space was becoming a critical concern. "Everyone please remain calm and stay in your seats," Sarah announced to the room, though she could see that panic was beginning to spread among the guests. Catherine had moved closer, her face pale with worry, while William was already reaching for his phone to summon additional help. Sarah's radio crackled to life as other members of the security team responded to her initial alert. "Control, this is Mitchell. I need immediate backup in the music room. We have a potential medical emergency involving Princess Charlotte. Also dispatch emergency medical services to our location immediately." The response was swift and professional. "Copy that, Mitchell. Backup is en route. Medical team is being notified." "What is the nature of the emergency?" "Princess Charlotte is trapped inside a performance prop. Unknown mechanical failure. She's conscious but confined in a small space with potentially limited air supply." Sarah's voice remained steady despite the gravity of the situation. Pemberton stood frozen several feet away, his face having gone completely white as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. "The mechanism has never failed before," he stammered. "There are safety protocols built into the design. She should have been able to exit immediately." "Tell me exactly how this device works," Sarah demanded, not taking her eyes off the box. "What are the emergency release mechanisms?" Pemberton approached cautiously, his hands shaking as he pointed to various parts of the box's exterior. "There should be a manual release here," he said, indicating a barely visible seam along one side. "And backup releases here and here. The entire system is designed to fail safe, meaning if anything goes wrong, the box should automatically open." Sarah examined the areas he had indicated, but none of the release mechanisms appeared to be functioning. The seams that should have allowed the box to open remained firmly sealed, as if something was actively preventing them from operating correctly. "Charlotte, can you hear me?" Sarah called out, pressing her ear close to the box. "I'm going to get you out of there, but I need you to tell me if you're hurt or if you're having trouble breathing." 2 taps came from inside, followed by a series of longer taps that Sarah quickly recognized as Morse code for "hard to breathe." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional approaches to opening the box were proving ineffective. She needed to think creatively and act decisively to prevent what could become a tragic accident. Additional security personnel burst into the room, led by Chief Inspector David Hartwell, the senior officer in charge of royal protection for the evening. His expression was grim as he quickly assessed the situation and moved to take control. "What's the status, Mitchell?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. "Princess Charlotte has been trapped inside this performance prop for approximately 8 minutes. She's conscious and responsive but reports difficulty breathing. All standard release mechanisms have failed, and we need immediate alternative solutions." Hartwell nodded, his years of experience evident in how quickly he processed the information and began issuing orders. "Stevens, clear the room of all non-essential personnel. Rodriguez, get the palace maintenance team up here immediately with cutting tools. Johnson, coordinate with emergency medical services and ensure they have a clear path to this location." As the other officers moved to carry out their orders, Hartwell turned his attention to Pemberton. "I need you to walk me through every detail of how this device operates. What could cause it to malfunction in this way?" Pemberton was visibly shaking now, the magnitude of what was happening clearly overwhelming him. "The box is designed with multiple safety systems," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are magnetic locks that should release automatically after a predetermined time, manual releases that can be activated from the outside, and even an emergency communications system that allows the person inside to signal if something goes wrong." "But none of these systems are working?" Hartwell pressed. "It appears that way, yes, but I don't understand how that's possible." The device was inspected this afternoon, and all systems were functioning perfectly. Sarah continued to monitor Charlotte's condition, speaking to her through the box and receiving increasingly weak responses. The young princess was clearly struggling, and time was running out. The prospect of using cutting tools to open the box was concerning, as there was no way to know exactly where Charlotte was positioned inside or whether the cutting process might inadvertently cause her harm. Catherine and William had been moved to a safer distance but remained in the room, their faces reflecting the agony of parents watching their child face mortal danger. Catherine was quietly crying while William stood with his jaw clenched, fighting to maintain his composure while feeling completely helpless. "Your Highnesses," Hartwell addressed them respectfully, "we may need to ask you to leave the room if we need to use power tools to open the device. The noise and potential debris could be dangerous." "We're not leaving," William replied firmly. "Whatever needs to be done, we'll stay out of the way, but we're not leaving our daughter." Hartwell nodded, understanding the parental instinct even as he considered the additional complications their presence might create. Professional protocol suggested that the area should be cleared of all non-essential personnel, but the emotional reality of the situation made such considerations feel cold and impractical. The palace maintenance team arrived within minutes, bringing with them an array of cutting tools and diagnostic equipment. The team leader, a veteran craftsman named Thomas Wright, who had worked at various royal residences for over 20 years, immediately began examining the box's construction. "This is a professional-grade piece," Wright observed, running his hands along the joints and seams. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing. These aren't standard theatrical construction methods." His observation sent a chill through the room. If the box was more sophisticated than a typical magic prop, it raised questions about whether the malfunction was truly accidental or if something more sinister might be at play. "How long to cut through it safely?" Hartwell asked. Wright studied the construction more carefully, using a small inspection mirror to look into the narrow gaps between the panels. "If we use the plasma cutter, maybe 15 minutes. But there's risk of heat damage or smoke inhalation for anyone inside. The safer approach would be to use manual tools, but that could take 45 minutes or more." "She doesn't have 45 minutes," Sarah said quietly, having continued to monitor Charlotte's responses. "Her tapping is getting weaker, and the intervals between responses are getting longer." As if to emphasize the urgency of the situation, a very faint tapping came from inside the box, much weaker than before. Sarah pressed her ear against the panel and could barely make out what sounded like labored breathing. "We need to try something else," she announced, stepping back from the box. "There has to be another way." It was then that Detective Constable James Murphy, one of the newer members of the Royal Protection Team, spoke up from where he had been examining the base of the box. "Ma'am, I think there might be something here." Everyone's attention turned to Murphy as he knelt beside the ornate platform on which the box was mounted. "The platform has some kind of electronic component built into it. There are LED indicators here that I don't think are part of the original design." Wright immediately joined Murphy in examining the platform, and within moments his expression grew grave. "This isn't part of the magic trick," he announced. "Someone has modified this device with additional electronic systems." The implications of this discovery hit everyone in the room simultaneously. What they had assumed was an accidental malfunction was beginning to look like something far more deliberate and dangerous. Hartwell immediately activated his radio. "Control, we need the bomb disposal unit at our location immediately. We have a potentially tampered device with electronic modifications of unknown purpose." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that they might be dealing not just with a mechanical failure, but with a deliberately sabotaged device. The idea that someone had intentionally modified the box to trap Charlotte was almost too horrible to contemplate. "Charlotte," Sarah called out, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring despite the growing crisis. "We're working on getting you out. I need you to stay as calm as possible and try to breathe slowly and steadily." The response from inside the box was barely audible, just the faintest of tapping that confirmed the young princess was still conscious but clearly in distress. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the palace's on-call physician, arrived just as the bomb disposal experts were being summoned. She immediately began conferring with Sarah about Charlotte's condition and the medical implications of prolonged confinement in a small space. Based on the dimensions of the box and assuming normal breathing patterns for a child her age, she has maybe 20 to 30 minutes of viable air supply remaining, Dr. Harper explained. Less if she's breathing rapidly due to panic or fear. The arrival of the bomb disposal team added another layer of complexity to an already dire situation. Sergeant Major Peter Collins, the team leader, needed time to assess whether the electronic modifications posed any immediate danger, but time was the one resource they didn't have. "Can you disable the electronics without triggering anything?" Hartwell asked. Collins studied the device carefully, using specialized equipment to detect electrical activity. "There's definitely active electronics here, but I can't determine their purpose without more extensive analysis. The safest approach would be to treat this as a potential explosive device until proven otherwise." "But that could take hours," Sarah protested. "She doesn't have hours." Collins nodded grimly. "I understand the time constraints, but if someone has booby-trapped this device, any attempt to force it open could trigger a much worse outcome." The room fell silent as everyone grappled with the horrible dilemma they faced. Attempting to cut open the box quickly might save Charlotte from suffocation, but could potentially trigger an explosive device. Taking the time to properly assess and disarm any potential threats might ensure everyone's safety, but could result in Charlotte suffocating before they could reach her. Sarah looked at the faces around the room, the anguished parents, the professional security officers trying to balance protocol with human compassion, the technical experts weighing impossible odds. In that moment, she realized that all the training and procedures in the world couldn't prepare someone for the emotional reality of watching a child's life hang in the balance. "There has to be something we're missing," she said aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. "Some detail or option that we haven't considered." It was William who provided the next crucial piece of information. "Charlotte has been taking piano lessons," he said quietly. "She's been learning to play some of the instruments in this very room." Sarah looked at him questioningly, not immediately understanding the relevance of this information. "The piano in the corner," William continued, pointing to an ornate grand piano that sat against the far wall. "It has a mechanical player system installed. Charlotte was fascinated by it during her last lesson because it uses the same type of pneumatic mechanisms that power some of the historical devices here in the palace." Wright's eyes lit up with understanding. If the box uses a similar pneumatic system for the locking mechanisms, there might be a central air supply that we could access. The maintenance chief immediately began examining the floor around the box more carefully, looking for any signs of air lines or mechanical connections that might lead to a central control system. Within minutes, his search revealed a carefully concealed access panel in the floor nearby. When opened, it exposed a complex network of pneumatic lines and electronic controls that appeared to be connected to the box's locking system. "This is it," Wright announced. "Someone has definitely modified this device, but if we can cut the pneumatic supply, the mechanical locks should fail to their open position." Collins examined the pneumatic system carefully, using his detection equipment to ensure that disabling it wouldn't trigger any other devices. "I'm not detecting any explosive signatures connected to this system," he reported. "It appears to be purely mechanical." Sarah felt a surge of hope as Wright prepared to disable the pneumatic system. "Charlotte, we think we found a way to get you out. Just hold on a little longer." The response from inside the box was barely perceptible, but it was still there, confirming that the young princess was still fighting to stay conscious. Wright carefully cut the main pneumatic line, and immediately the sound of escaping air filled the room. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, and Sarah felt her heart sink with the possibility that their solution wouldn't work. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the seams of the box began to separate. The magnetic and mechanical locks that had held it closed were losing their grip as the pneumatic pressure that powered them was released. "It's working," Sarah breathed, hardly daring to believe that their desperate gambit might actually succeed. As the box continued to open, revealing Charlotte curled up inside, pale but conscious, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her that was unlike anything she had ever experienced in her professional career. The young princess looked up at the faces surrounding her with eyes that were tired and frightened, but undeniably alive. Catherine rushed forward as Charlotte was carefully lifted from the box, gathering her daughter into her arms with tears streaming down her face. William was beside them in an instant, his own composure finally breaking as he realized that their daughter was safe. "Doctor." Harper immediately began examining Charlotte, checking her vital signs and ensuring that she hadn't suffered any serious effects from her ordeal. "She's going to be fine," she announced to the room. "Mild oxygen deprivation, but nothing that won't resolve completely with rest and observation." Sarah stood back. watching the reunion between parents and child, and felt the weight of what had just happened beginning to settle on her shoulders. They had averted a tragedy, but the questions surrounding how and why the device had been tampered with were just beginning. As Charlotte recovered in her parents' arms, she looked over at Sarah with a maturity that seemed far beyond her 7 years. "Thank you for listening," she said quietly, her voice still weak from her ordeal. Sarah nodded, understanding that the young princess was referring not just to her rescue, but to her decision to trust the SOS signal and act on her instincts despite the potential consequences for her career. The immediate crisis was over, but Sarah realized that the investigation into what had really happened would be just beginning. Someone had deliberately modified a device intended to entertain a child into something that could have killed her. The implications of that fact would reverberate through the royal security establishment for years to come. Hartwell approached Sarah as the medical team continued to monitor Charlotte's condition. "That was good work, Mitchell. Your decision to act when you did probably saved her life." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they had been incredibly fortunate. If Charlotte hadn't known Morse code, if she hadn't thought to use it to signal for help, if any number of small details had been different, the outcome could have been catastrophic. As the room slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy, with Charlotte stable and the immediate danger past, Sarah began to consider the larger implications of what had occurred. Someone with sophisticated knowledge of both magic tricks and security systems had deliberately created a death trap disguised as entertainment. The investigation that would follow would need to answer not just how this had happened, but why someone would want to harm a 7-year-old princess, and whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger threat to the royal family. For now, though, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had trusted her instincts, broken protocol when it mattered most, and helped save a child's life. Whatever consequences might follow from her actions, she knew she had made the right choice. The hours following Charlotte's rescue unfolded with the methodical precision of a major criminal investigation. Kensington Palace had been transformed from a birthday celebration venue into a secure crime scene, with forensic specialists, security analysts, and counter-terrorism experts working through the night to understand exactly what had happened and who was responsible. Sarah found herself at the center of the investigation not as a suspect, but as the primary witness whose quick thinking had prevented a tragedy. She had been debriefed multiple times by different agencies, each wanting to understand exactly what she had observed and when she had first realized something was wrong. Assistant Commissioner Margaret Whitfield, the senior officer responsible for royal protection across all locations, had arrived within 2 hours of the incident. Whitfield was a formidable woman whose career had been built on the principle that royal security was not just about protecting individuals, but about preserving the stability of the entire institution of the monarchy. Detective Sergeant Mitchell, Whitfield began as she settled into the chair across from Sarah in one of the palace's smaller conference rooms. "I want you to walk me through your decision-making process from the moment you first felt something was wrong." Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "It started as just a feeling. Something I couldn't quite identify." Princess Charlotte seemed more nervous than excited about participating in the magic show. Her body language was telling me she was uncomfortable, but I couldn't determine why. "And yet you didn't act on those initial instincts," Whitfield observed, making notes on her tablet. "No, ma'am. Those kinds of feelings aren't unusual at these events. Children can be nervous about performing in front of adults, even in a family setting. It wasn't until I heard the SOS signal that I knew something was genuinely wrong." Whitfield leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about the Morse code. How certain are you that's what you were hearing?" "Completely certain, ma'am." 3 short taps, pause. 3 long taps, pause. 3 short taps. It was textbook SOS, and it was being repeated consistently. There was no question that someone inside that box was calling for help. "And your decision to interrupt the performance rather than following established protocol?" This was the question Sarah had been expecting, the one that could potentially end her career with the Royal Protection Unit. "Ma'am, established protocol called for me to observe and assess, then coordinate with other officers before taking action. But in this case, I judged that following protocol could result in the death of the person I was sworn to protect." Whitfield made more notes, her expression unreadable. "That's a significant decision, Sergeant. Breaking protocol during a royal event could have had serious consequences if you had been wrong." "Yes, ma'am. I understand that. But I wasn't wrong. The investigation had already revealed disturbing details about the modified magic box. Forensic analysis showed that someone with considerable technical expertise had altered the device's pneumatic and electronic systems in ways that would allow it to function normally during testing and initial use, but then malfunction catastrophically when activated during an actual performance. The modifications were sophisticated and deliberate. The person responsible had intimate knowledge not only of the device's original design, but also of security protocols and inspection procedures. They had created a trap that would pass all standard safety checks but become a death trap when activated. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Hayes, who was leading the criminal investigation, briefed the security team on the technical findings. The device was modified with a timer system that would allow normal operation for approximately 6 minutes before engaging the locking mechanisms. This would give the performer time to go through the initial parts of the routine and build audience engagement before the trap was activated. The implications were chilling. Someone had planned not just to harm Charlotte, but to do so in a way that would maximize psychological impact on both her family and the watching guests. It was an act of terrorism disguised as entertainment. "Do we have any leads on who might have had access to modify the device?" Whitfield asked. Hayes consulted his notes. "We're looking at everyone who had contact with the prop from the time it was delivered to the palace until the performance began. That includes the performer, obviously, but also palace staff, security personnel who conducted the initial inspection, and the entertainment booking agent who arranged for the performance." Sarah listened to the briefing with growing unease. The more they learned about the sophistication of the plot, the more she realized how close they had come to a catastrophic failure of the entire security system. If Charlotte hadn't known Morse code, if she hadn't thought to use it, if the sound hadn't been audible from outside the box, the evening could have ended in tragedy. "What about the performer himself?" Sarah asked. "Marcus Pemberton. What do we know about his background?" Hayes pulled up a file on his laptop. "Pemberton has been performing professionally for 15 years. Clean criminal record, excellent references, no known connections to any radical groups or anti-monarchy organizations. He appears genuinely shocked by what happened and has been fully cooperative with the investigation. Could he have been unknowingly used by someone else? That's our working theory. Someone with access to his equipment and knowledge of his routines could have made the modifications without his knowledge. We're currently tracking his movements for the past month and examining everyone who might have had access to his props." The investigation was also revealing uncomfortable truths about security protocols. The device had passed all required inspections, but those inspections had focused on obvious threats, like weapons or explosives, rather than subtle mechanical sabotage. The incident was exposing gaps in procedures that had been considered comprehensive. Dr. Kemp, Michael Sterling, a forensic psychologist brought in to develop a profile of the perpetrator, presented his preliminary analysis to the team. "We're dealing with someone who has both technical expertise and intimate knowledge of royal security procedures. They understand how inspections are conducted and designed their modifications to exploit those specific procedures." "Are we looking at an insider threat?" Whitfield asked the question that everyone had been thinking but no one wanted to voice. "It's a possibility we can't ignore," Sterling replied. "The level of detailed knowledge required suggests either an insider or someone who has had extensive access to insider information." The psychological impact on the royal family was also becoming apparent. Charlotte had shown remarkable composure during the incident itself, but the trauma of the experience was beginning to manifest in the hours that followed. Child psychologists had been brought in to help her process what had happened and to monitor for any lasting effects. William and Catherine had remained remarkably composed throughout the crisis, but the strain was evident in their faces and demeanor. The realization that someone had specifically targeted their daughter for assassination was almost incomprehensible, and they were struggling to understand how such a plot could have come so close to succeeding. Sarah was granted permission to visit Charlotte the following morning, partly as a debriefing requirement, but also because the young princess had specifically asked to see her. She found Charlotte in the family's private apartments, sitting with her mother and appearing much more like a normal 7-year-old than she had during the previous evening's ordeal. "Hello, Princess Charlotte," Sarah said, settling into a chair across from where Charlotte was curled up next to Catherine on a comfortable sofa. "Hello, Sarah," Charlotte replied, her voice still carrying a slight hoarseness from her ordeal. "Mummy says I should thank you for saving my life." Sarah smiled gently. "You saved your own life, Princess. You were the one who was smart enough to use Morse code to call for help. I just listened." Charlotte considered this for a moment. "I was scared," she admitted quietly. "The box got smaller and smaller, and I couldn't get out. I remembered the signal from my lessons and hoped someone would understand." "You were very brave," Sarah assured her, "and very clever. Not many people would have thought to do what you did." Catherine had been listening to the exchange with tears in her eyes. "We can't thank you enough for trusting your instincts and acting when you did. If you had followed normal procedures." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood exactly what the alternative outcome might have been. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of William, who had spent the morning in briefings with security officials and government ministers. The incident had prompted a complete review of royal security procedures, and there were urgent discussions about whether other members of the royal family might be at risk from similar plots. "Any updates on the investigation?" Catherine asked as William joined them. "They've identified several people who had access to the performers' equipment in the days leading up to the event. The net is narrowing, but they still haven't identified a primary suspect." William's expression was grim. "What's becoming clear is that this was planned months in advance. Someone has been watching our family and studying our security procedures for a very long time." The investigation had indeed been making progress, though much of it was pointing toward conclusions that no one wanted to accept. The level of planning and inside knowledge required suggested that the plot involved someone with legitimate access to royal events and security information. Detective Chief Inspector Hayes had been coordinating with counter-terrorism specialists and had developed a short list of individuals who met the profile of someone capable of carrying out such an attack. The list was troublingly short and included people who had been trusted with the safety of the royal family. Sarah returned to her regular duties the following week, though the investigation continued around her. She had been commended for her actions and assured that there would be no negative consequences for breaking protocol under such circumstances. In fact, her decision-making during the crisis was being used as a case study for revising security procedures. The new protocols being developed would place greater emphasis on individual officer judgment and would provide clearer guidelines for when breaking established procedures was not only acceptable, but necessary. Sarah's actions had demonstrated that rigid adherence to protocol could sometimes be counterproductive when dealing with unprecedented situations. The psychological evaluation of her decision-making process had revealed interesting insights about how experienced officers develop instincts that can be more reliable than formal procedures in certain situations. Her years of experience and deep familiarity with the royal family's normal behaviors had allowed her to detect subtle warning signs that might have been missed by someone following a checklist approach to security. However, the incident had also highlighted the vulnerability of even the most secure environments to sophisticated inside threats. The Royal Protection Unit was facing uncomfortable questions about how well they really knew the people they trusted with the most sensitive aspects of royal security. 3 weeks after the incident, the investigation finally yielded its first major breakthrough. Analysis of the modified electronics in the magic box had revealed components that could be traced to a specific supplier. The supplier's records showed that the components had been purchased by someone using falsified credentials, but security camera footage from the supplier's location had captured images of the buyer. The person in the footage was someone the investigation team recognized: David Morrison, a freelance technical consultant who had worked on several royal events over the past 2 years. Morrison had been responsible for inspecting and maintaining various types of electronic equipment used in palace functions, giving him both access to royal facilities and detailed knowledge of security procedures. Morrison's background check had been clean when he was first hired, but further investigation revealed that his true identity was quite different from what appeared in his employment records. He was actually David Kellerman, a former military technician who had been dishonorably discharged from the Army 5 years earlier following a court-martial for theft and insubordination. The discovery of Morrison's true identity explained how he had been able to modify the magic box so skillfully, and how he had known exactly what security procedures to circumvent. His military background had given him the technical skills, while his work with royal events had provided the access and inside knowledge necessary to plan such an attack. The manhunt for Morrison began immediately, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and international cooperation with security services in several countries. His disappearance after the failed attack suggested that he had prepared an escape plan and might have already fled the country. Sarah was called in for another debriefing when Morrison was identified, as investigators wanted to know if she had ever encountered him during her security duties. She reviewed photographs and employment records but couldn't recall any specific interactions with the man, though she acknowledged that she might have seen him working at various events without taking particular notice. The fact that none of us specifically remember him is probably exactly what he was counting on, Whitfield observed during the briefing. He was maintaining a low profile while gathering intelligence and planning his attack. The investigation also revealed that Morrison had been conducting surveillance of the royal family for much longer than initially suspected. Digital forensics experts had traced online searches and location data that showed he had been systematically studying the family's routines, public appearances, and security arrangements for at least 18 months. Most disturbing was the discovery that Charlotte had not been his only intended target. Evidence found in Morrison's abandoned apartment included detailed plans for attacks on other members of the royal family, including Prince George and Prince Louis. The birthday party incident appeared to have been intended as the first in a series of planned attacks. The scope of Morrison's planning and the sophistication of his approach prompted a complete overhaul of background check procedures for anyone working in proximity to royal events. The incident had demonstrated that traditional vetting processes were insufficient to identify individuals who had taken deliberate steps to conceal their true identities and intentions. Sarah found herself thinking often about the randomness of how the plot had been discovered. If Charlotte hadn't learned Morse code in school, if she hadn't thought to use it during her ordeal, if Sarah hadn't been positioned where she could hear the tapping, the attack would likely have succeeded. The margin between success and failure had been measured in seconds and small details. The experience had also changed her perspective on the nature of royal protection. She had always understood that the job involved protecting people from potential threats, but the Charlotte incident had brought home the reality that some of those threats might come from within the very system designed to keep the royal family safe. As the investigation continued and security procedures were revised, Sarah remained committed to her role but with a deeper understanding of its complexities. She had learned that sometimes the most important decisions couldn't be found in any manual or training program, but had to come from trusting one's instincts and being willing to accept responsibility for the consequences. The incident had also reinforced her belief that the human element remained the most important component of any security system, no matter how sophisticated the technology or comprehensive the procedures. In the end, it had been a combination of a brave little girl's quick thinking and an experienced officer's willingness to trust her instincts that had prevented a tragedy that could have shaken the monarchy to its core. 6 months had passed since the incident at Kensington Palace, and the reverberations were still being felt throughout the royal security establishment. David Morrison had been apprehended 3 weeks earlier in a small coastal town in Portugal, living under yet another false identity. His extradition to Britain had been swift, and he now awaited trial on charges that included attempted murder, terrorism, and conspiracy against the crown. Sarah Mitchell stood in the witness preparation room at the Old Bailey, reviewing her testimony one final time before taking the stand. The trial had garnered international attention, not just because of the target, but because of the unprecedented nature of the security breach. The case had exposed vulnerabilities in royal protection that no one had previously imagined possible. The lead prosecutor, Sir Jonathan Hartley QC, had spent considerable time with Sarah preparing her testimony. Her decision to break protocol had become a central element of the prosecution's case, demonstrating both the severity of the threat and the quick thinking that had prevented a national tragedy. Remember, Sir Jonathan advised, the defense will likely try to suggest that your actions were premature or that you misinterpreted what you were hearing. Stay focused on the facts of what you observed and the decisions you made based on your training and experience. Sarah nodded, though she knew that her testimony would be scrutinized not just by the legal teams, but by security professionals around the world who were watching to see how the incident would be officially characterized and what precedents it might set for future protocols. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, royal protection officers, and members of the public who had been selected through a lottery system for the limited available seats. The presence of so many observers added weight to an already significant moment in Sarah's career. Morrison himself appeared remarkably ordinary as he sat in the dock. He was a slight man in his early 40s, with thinning hair and unremarkable features that had undoubtedly helped him blend into various work environments without attracting attention. Looking at him now, Sarah found it difficult to reconcile his mundane appearance with the sophisticated and malevolent plot he had conceived and executed. When called to the stand, Sarah took the oath and settled into the witness chair with the composure that came from years of giving testimony in various criminal cases. However, this testimony felt different from any she had given before, both because of its high profile and because her own decision-making was as much on trial as Morrison's actions. Sir Jonathan led her through the events of that evening with methodical precision, establishing the timeline and her observations at each critical moment. Sarah described her initial unease, her recognition of Charlotte's nervous behavior, and the crucial moment when she first heard the SOS signal. In your professional opinion, Detective Sergeant Mitchell, how long did you estimate Princess Charlotte had been trapped when you first heard the distress signal? Based on the timing of the performance and when I first detected the signal, I estimated she had been confined in the device for approximately 6 to 7 minutes, sir. And what was your assessment of the urgency of the situation? Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. Given the confined space, the potential for limited air supply, and the clear distress being communicated through the Morse code, I judged that immediate action was necessary to prevent serious harm or death. The prosecutor then asked her to explain her decision to interrupt the performance rather than following established security protocols. Sir, the established protocol would have been to observe the situation, coordinate with other officers, and develop a response plan. However, in this case, I judged that following standard protocol would consume time that the victim did not have. The Morse code signal indicated immediate distress, and I believe that delay could result in death. Were you concerned about the potential professional consequences of breaking established protocol? Yes, sir. I was aware that my actions could have negative implications for my career. However, my primary duty as a protection officer is to safeguard the lives of those under our care. In this situation, I believe that duty superseded other considerations. The defense barrister, Helena Morrison QC, no relation to the defendant, approached her cross-examination with the aggressive style that had made her reputation in high-profile criminal cases. She immediately challenged Sarah's interpretation of the events and her decision-making process. Detective Sergeant Mitchell, you testified that you felt something was wrong from early in the evening. Isn't it true that such feelings are quite common in your line of work, and that acting on every such instinct would make effective security impossible?
Yes, ma'am, such feelings are common.
That's why I didn't act on my initial concerns, but continued to observe and assess the situation. But you ultimately did act on what was essentially a feeling, did you not? You interrupted a performance based on sounds that you interpreted as Morse code, but which could have been explained in any number of innocent ways. Sarah remained calm, having anticipated this line of questioning. Ma'am, the sound I heard was unambiguously SOS in Morse code. It was repeated multiple times, with consistent timing and pattern. There was no ambiguity in what was being communicated. But you couldn't actually see Princess Charlotte at that time, could you? You had no visual confirmation that she was in distress? That's correct, ma'am. The nature of the magic trick meant she was concealed from view. However, the Morse code signal provided clear auditory evidence of distress. Ms. Morrison continued to probe Sarah's decision-making, trying to establish that her actions had been premature and potentially dangerous. Isn't it true that your interruption of the performance could have caused panic among the guests, potentially creating a more dangerous situation than actually existed? Ma'am, the safety of Princess Charlotte was my primary concern. While I was mindful of the need to maintain order, I judged that the immediate risk to her life outweighed other considerations. The cross-examination continued for over an hour, with the defense counsel systematically challenging every aspect of Sarah's testimony and decision-making process. However, Sarah's years of experience giving testimony served her well, and she maintained her composure throughout the aggressive questioning. The prosecution's case had been strengthened considerably by the technical evidence recovered from Morrison's apartment and digital devices. Expert witnesses had testified about the sophisticated modifications to the magic box and the extensive surveillance and planning that had preceded the attack. Dr. Elizabeth Crenshaw, a forensic psychologist, had provided testimony about Morrison's psychological profile and his motivations for targeting the royal family. Her analysis revealed a complex individual whose military discharge had triggered a deep resentment toward authority figures, which had eventually evolved into a specific fixation on the monarchy as a symbol of the establishment that had rejected him. The trial also heard from Marcus Pemberton, the magician whose equipment had been sabotaged. His testimony revealed how Morrison had gained access to his props by posing as a venue security consultant who needed to inspect the equipment as part of his duties. Pemberton had been completely unaware that his cooperation was facilitating an assassination attempt. Perhaps most compelling was the testimony from the technical experts who had analyzed the modified magic box. They demonstrated in court how the device had been altered to function normally during testing, but then malfunctioned catastrophically during actual use. The sophistication of the modifications left no doubt about the premeditated nature of Morrison's actions. Charlotte herself did not testify at the trial, as the court had determined that requiring a 7-year-old to relive the traumatic experience in a public forum would not be in her best interests. However, her parents provided impact statements describing the psychological effects the incident had had on their daughter and their family. William's statement was particularly powerful as he described the helplessness of watching his daughter face mortal danger and being unable to help her. The defendant's actions not only threatened my daughter's life, but violated the most fundamental trust that any parent has in the institutions designed to protect our children, he stated. The trial also served as a forum for examining the broader implications of the security breach. Senior officials from various law enforcement agencies testified about the changes that had been implemented in response to the incident and the ongoing efforts to prevent similar attacks. Assistant Commissioner Whitfield testified about the comprehensive review of royal protection procedures that had been conducted following the incident. Detective Sergeant Mitchell's actions on the night in question highlighted both the strengths and limitations of our existing protocols, she stated. Her quick thinking and willingness to trust her professional instincts prevented a tragedy, but the incident also revealed vulnerabilities in our systems that required immediate attention. The changes implemented in response to the incident had been extensive. Background check procedures had been completely overhauled, with new requirements for verification of identity and employment history. Technical inspection protocols had been expanded to include more sophisticated analysis of electronic and mechanical systems. Most significantly, new guidelines had been established that gave individual officers greater latitude to deviate from standard procedures when circumstances warranted immediate action. Sarah's decision to break protocol had become the foundation for what was now known as the Mitchell Doctrine within royal protection circles. This principle established that officers had not only the authority but the obligation to override standard procedures when they determined that following those procedures could result in harm to those under their protection. The doctrine had been controversial within some law enforcement circles, as it essentially formalized the concept that individual judgment could supersede established protocols. Critics argued that it could lead to chaos and inconsistent decision-making. Supporters contended that it recognized the reality that no set of procedures could anticipate every possible scenario, and that experienced officers needed the flexibility to adapt their responses to unexpected situations. As the trial progressed toward its conclusion, the evidence against Morrison became overwhelming. The technical evidence, combined with his digital surveillance of the royal family and the discovery of plans for additional attacks, left little doubt about his guilt. His defense team's strategy of questioning the investigation and the actions of the protection officers had failed to create reasonable doubt about his culpability. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Morrison's expression remained unchanged as the verdicts were read, showing no emotion or remorse for his actions. His sentencing was scheduled for the following week, though legal experts predicted he would receive multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. Sarah watched from the public gallery as Morrison was led away, feeling a complex mixture of relief and reflection. The trial had officially validated her actions on that night 6 months earlier, but she knew that the real validation had come from Charlotte's survival and recovery. In the weeks following the trial, Sarah found herself something of a celebrity within law enforcement circles. She received commendations from various agencies and was invited to speak at conferences about crisis decision-making and security protocols. However, she remained focused on her primary duties and was careful not to let the attention affect her approach to her work. The incident had also led to her promotion to detective inspector, with specific responsibility for developing and implementing the new flexible response protocols that had emerged from the Mitchell Doctrine. Her new role involved training other officers in situational assessment and decision-making, helping them develop the skills needed to make effective judgments when standard procedures might be insufficient. Charlotte had recovered well from her ordeal, though she continued to work with counselors to process the experience. Her parents had made a point of ensuring that she understood she was safe and that the people responsible for protecting her family had learned important lessons from what had happened. Sarah was invited to Charlotte's 8th birthday celebration the following year, a much smaller and more secure affair than the previous year's party. The young princess greeted her warmly and seemed to have retained none of the trauma that might have been expected from such an experience. "I've been practicing more Morse code," Charlotte told Sarah during the party. "Mummy says it's a useful skill to have." Sarah smiled, recognizing that Charlotte's parents were helping her process the experience by framing her quick thinking as a positive skill, rather than dwelling on the danger she had faced. The incident at Kensington Palace had indeed changed royal protection forever, but it had also reinforced the importance of human judgment and experience in even the most technology-dependent security environments. Sarah's willingness to trust her instincts and act decisively had not only saved a child's life, but had contributed to making the entire royal protection system more effective and responsive. As she watched Charlotte enjoy her birthday celebration, surrounded by family and protected by enhanced security measures that had grown out of the previous year's crisis, Sarah reflected on the strange way that professional and personal fulfillment could emerge from moments of extreme pressure and difficult decisions. The Mitchell Doctrine had become part of security training programs around the world, and Sarah regularly received requests to consult on protection protocols for high-profile individuals and organizations. However, she remained committed to her role with the Royal Protection Unit, knowing that the trust placed in her by the royal family was both a privilege and a responsibility that she would never take lightly. Morrison had been sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, bringing legal closure to the case. However, the broader implications of his plot continued to influence security thinking and procedures. The incident had demonstrated that the greatest threats to protected individuals might come not from obvious enemies, but from those who had been granted access and trust. Sarah's story had become a case study taught in law enforcement academies and security training programs, illustrating how experience, intuition, and courage could combine to prevent tragedy when rigid adherence to procedures might have failed. Her decision to break protocol had been vindicated not only by its successful outcome, but by its contribution to improving protection methods for everyone who served in similar roles. The young princess who had shown such remarkable courage and presence of mind during her ordeal had returned to a normal childhood, but the lessons learned from that terrifying evening continued to protect her and others who might face similar threats in the future. Sarah's choice to listen, to trust, and to act had rippled outward in ways that would enhance security and save lives for years to come. In the end, the incident at Kensington Palace had proven that sometimes the most important protocols are the ones that tell us when to abandon protocol altogether, and that the greatest security systems are those that empower the people within them to think, to judge, and to act with wisdom and courage when the situation demands it.